So I had just watched a YouTube video, which I believe all of the videos that we always watch are always drawn by the Sams. And I think I discovered something that's very simple, but it's a very powerful measure, is that which is common irregardless of subjects is independent of subjectivity, which means it's either relative or objective. But if it's uncommon between subjects, then it's dependent upon subjectivity. So that lets us determine exactly what fits in each of these fields. So we don't have to axiomatically assert what is subjective versus what is objective. We can actually objectively measure this. And by objectively measure, I guess I should say accurately measure what falls into which field, just simply by determining what is it that's common among those fields and what is uncommon. What changes among subjects, between subjects, and what changes between objects. And then we can determine where those lines really are. So, for example, something that changes between subjects would be a subjective experience. Like, what does my voice sound like? Versus an objective trait, which would be like, what is the exact tone or pitch? Or what were the exact words spoken? So, by this standard, where we're just measuring what's common and what's uncommon, then we can measure what is dependent and what is independent from these fields. And the reason that this is powerful is because it's one less thing to argue about. And the less arguments that we have, the more streamlined everything is, because it doesn't have to stop at the argument. It can go past it and, move on to something else. Hopefully including things that we can do together without conflict. So it also brings to mind why the code is used and why chaos helps. Is given chaos, given randomness, given an equal chance among all possible states, then we'll have a very clear resolution as to where things fit, because no one will have inflated or deflated or distorted the data. It will just shine through clearly. And what makes that significant, interesting, and significant. I tried to say both of those at the same time and it came out insignificant. Is since we use randomness and chaos in order to arrive at this conclusion the most clearly that we can, that means again that God or whoever or whatever caused all of this to happen did so by giving us a free hand where we don't have any favor or disfavor attributed to us. In other words, the free market, for example, didn't artificially favor George Soros. It's just that George Soros was able to capitalize on it the best, and so then he ended up with the most money. And in that way, we all are equally left the same chances in life. We just choose to do what we will with those choices. But some of us are more well endowed than others in certain areas and less endowed than others in other areas. And so then there's a difference between us in our initial circumstances, where we're born, what our family's like, and all that. And that does have a huge impact because, like all chaotic systems, if you change the initial conditions, then you often change the whole rest of it. I just watched a film about that on double pendulums, and it's actually quite fascinating. The differences that happen because of the initial conditions of those pendulums, where they're located relative to each other, if they're up or down, what angle, and all of that. And then if you let them go freely, then they have a completely diverse range of outputs because of those initial conditions being slightly different. And so, what is it that makes things have those initial conditions that are slightly different? Why did I get born into my family instead of, a less affluent one, or in some other country like in Africa or China or something like that? Why did I end up getting born in America? Why did I end up being born with really fast metabolism where I can never gain weight no matter how much I eat? Why did all of that happen? And if there is this true randomness that's throughout the universe, then why didn't it apply to that subject? Why didn't it apply to my initial conditions? And the only way that I can explain that is if we take that and project it, where it's like there's always somewhere it all equalizes. If my initial conditions in this life are different from yours in this life, then maybe in another life they weren't. And arguably, I can say that, at least it's a possibility, because I came from somewhere. I can't have come from nothing. And I guess you could argue that with everything in general is like, if you claim that it all came from nothing, then you have to give me this paradox of something being nothing or something being directly adjacent to nothing, and then you have to describe an edge to nothing, which it can't really have because it isn't there. So, and this goes tangentially kind of back to my other talk before about what's beyond modality, and I did remember that I had actually found something that is beyond modality, is anti-modality, which is our antimodes. And just like a mode is determined by what is possible, then an anti-mode is determined by what is impossible. And so they're kind of negations of each other. And I say kind of because just because something is impossible doesn't mean that there's an equal but opposite possibility. It just means that, because sometimes everything becomes impossible. There are systems that you can look at, like 2 + 2 = 5, where everything is impossible. It not only is 2 + 2 impossible, but so is 1 + 1 and all the derivatives and, antecedents and precedents of all those numbers all become impossible. The entire field of mathematics then becomes impossible, and then anything that's related to mathematics also becomes impossible, and then everything becomes impossible. So just because things are impossible doesn't make the opposite of them possible. It just makes it impossible in that one instance. So there is a little bit of diversity there, where it's not like you can map out anti-modality as the mere shadow of modality or vice versa. They do fit in some ways, and you could predict some things about some attributes of modality from anti-modality, such as you won't find possibility in the field of modality that's also an impossibility in the field of anti-modality. Simply because it's impossible, it never reaches the field of modality to become a possibility. And the only thing that makes something possible is the absence of impossibilities, the absence of there needing to be necessarily some alternative. If there is a necessity for an alternative, then it makes it impossible. The fact that there are no alternatives means that all other possibilities are rendered impossible, except for that one. And that's the mechanism by which something becomes real, that drops down into the three absolutes of our reality. Before that, where it's just possibilities of something that isn't quite yet existent, then it's talking about the absence of impossibility, the absence of certainty. And so, given freedom, we automatically have possibility. Only when there is no more freedom do we have impossibility. No, only when there aren't any other alternatives do we get impossibility and certainty. And certainty is just the one possibility that isn't impossible. And impossibility in general would be just there are no possibilities, where everything becomes impossible. And so, anti-modality, that field is the dark crystal. And that has to deal with, if you knew that, if you had the dark crystal, which is the entire field of anti-modality, which is the composition of all impossibilities, then, at least theoretically, you could never be wrong. If you had that field in its total composition, which is impossible because it's infinite, then you could never be wrong. Now, granted, you could have parts of the dark crystal, you could have shards of it, and you could say, within this region, I can never be wrong. But then you can't say that that region is necessary. Or you could say that it's not necessary right here, right now, etc. And so it's not perfect because it's not ever complete on our side, inside of creation, inside of, finitude. But at an absolute scale, you can start to see these compositions, and you can start to see how a god or some being that's on the outside of all this would be able to predict at least what would never happen. And of course, given the field of all possibilities, which would be timeless because it hasn't actualized, it isn't restricted upon actualization, it just tells you what is possible, then you would have everything that could ever possibly happen all landscaped into a single composition, which I call the light crystal. That's the field of all possibilities. That's the field of modality. And the thing that distinguishes them, like I said, is the field of modality is about all the possibilities, which means that there's always at least one possibility, where there's always at least one other alternative. So the distinction is in the number of alternatives that are there. If there aren't any alternatives, then you're either in the certainty of anti-modality or you're in the certainty of actualized reality. If there's a possibility, then it's either not yet actualized, or at least in this variant of our experience isn't accessible yet, but it could be in some other variant or in some other place or time. So all of that is to say that there is a superstructure, but we just can't ever complete that composition. We'll always have more room, and it will always have more resolution, and there will always be at least a slight amount of doubt in every conclusion that we draw. But those conclusions are far vaster than the conclusions that we could draw inside of a submodal system, whose only mechanism is to determine if-then implications based upon, assertions that we hold to be self-evident, which is the default. It's something that is intuitive to the human race, at least, is to assume the submodal view that I am right, therefore everyone that doesn't agree with me must be wrong. And it's simpler, and it does streamline things, but the problem with it is that it's so tiny that it can't integrate with anything that isn't identical to itself. In other words, it's intolerant and exclusive, and because of that, it disintegrates in the larger whole. It integrates with other submodal views, which is how the Nazis ever gained power to begin with. They didn't all fight against each other. They did have the same views, but the problem was that those views could not ever be integrated across the entire human race, because it necessarily excluded so many people that would just naturally arise from just, normally existing, like gypsies. There's always going to be gypsies. Homosexuals, there's always going to be homosexuals. Jews, well, you might be able to kill all the Jews, but your definition of who is Jewish and who isn't, one drop rule, what was that? one drop of blood rule or something like that. Like if anyone in your entire lineage was ever Jewish, then you're considered Jewish yourself. Is that the way that you distinguish a Jew from a non-Jew, or do they have to be 100% Jewish? Would some like a Jew and a non-Jew that got married and had kids, would their kids be considered Jewish? If you say that they have to be 100% Jew to be considered a Jew, then no, their kids wouldn't be Jewish. But if it's the one drop rule, then yes, they would be. And so would their kids and their kids and their kids and their kids forever and ever and ever and ever. And that's the one drop rule, which, like I said, is unsustainable. Because if you have the one drop rule applied, and let's say you killed off everybody that had even one drop of Jewish blood in their lineage, and so you successfully eradicated all of them, by what metric are you using to determine whether or not someone's family was Jewish? Well, back then, they wouldn't have been able to pull it off because they didn't have Ancestry.com. They didn't have any way of DNA testing. Now, let's say that there is such a thing as Jewish DNA, which I still really don't buy, although they've done enough studies to show that there's at least some statistical significance of similitude between people who originate in certain geographic locations. Because of our initial conditions, we can actually retrace those initial conditions and then determine whether or not the person originated in this tribe or that tribe. And so the resolution has grown, but it will never be perfect. And like I had said, now if you use that DNA testing, if we were to do the same thing now, would Nazis make it now? Well, if your resolution is such that you can say that you can map it onto something that's objective like DNA, genomes, and you can successfully determine that there are some people that have the same genomes, and then you can somehow independently confirm that yes, indeed, their ancestry goes back to that same geographic location, and you have at least 100% accuracy, then yeah. But what do you know of a measure that has 100% accuracy? Every measure has at least some inaccuracy. So if you could say that there's at least one of these genomes that exists 100% of the time when someone's ancestry comes from the specific geographic location, then yeah, you could. But then it would only be limited to those genomes that you would have 100% accuracy in that prediction. For all the genes that don't, then you would have to then consider that they are not Jewish then and allow them to survive. So then, let's say that they completed their mission and killed all the Jews off. Well, what are you going to do about gypsies and homosexuals that appear naturally all the time? You can't ever eradicate it. You can kill the person after having committed the crime, but they'll always have the ability to commit the crime first. So then you could put everybody in a gulag system where they're born in chains and they can't do that. Well, how are you going to do that unless you have some people who are allowed to run around freely to check on those who can't? So that way you can catch people that run off, or you can make sure that there's no contraband, etc., being transferred between people. Or you serve some artificial intelligence AI overlord that puts you in a box and never lets you out. And everybody grows up in isolation where they can't hurt anyone else. And then people just commit suicide, or they aren't born anymore because why would the AI want people anyway? And other problems like that. The problem with those types of systems, like the Nazi systems, is that they don't stand for anything. So inevitably, they just get destroyed because they can't tolerate anything but themselves. Any system that can't tolerate its own environment will die by necessity, not because there's something intrinsically evil about it, but just because it can't survive its environment because it can't tolerate it. So the first thing that an organism or a system, any system, has to be able to do is to tolerate what isn't it. So whatever is not it must still be allowed to exist, because if it can't exist in its presence, then it won't exist, because there's always more things that something is not than there are things that are it. For example, if it's the Nazis, there's always more races than there are of just the single Germanic race. There's the Slavic races, there's the Portuguese, there's Jordanese, there's Sudanese, Ethiopian, Native American, French, Spanish, etc. So there's way more of what isn't that system than what is that system. So the system can't afford to be intolerant. It has too many neighbors. There's too much diversity for it to be able to do that. And let's say it was just two. Then, yeah, it could. It would have a 50% chance of survival anyway. It's still not that great, but it could at least have a 50% survival rate, because if it kills its neighbor, then it then becomes the only system in existence, and then it can be intolerant because there's nothing except it, and so then it can just tolerate itself, and then that's fine, and it can sustain itself. Such as if there was only the Germans and the French, for example. Then if the Germans kill off the French, then it can just sit there and sustain itself and grow indefinitely because it can tolerate its own race. Then it's fine. But if it doesn't kill off the French, then it doesn't survive, and then it's gone, and that's it. And so it only has a 50% survival rate if that's it, and that's only if there's only two types or two independent systems. If there's three independent systems, it has only 1/3 chance, which means it's most likely not going to survive. And at that point onward, it just gets less and less and less likely for it to survive. The more systems that there are that are independent of each other, the less likely an intolerant system will survive. And given that we've moved well beyond the initial conditions of this entire universe as a chaotic system, we can safely say that there are always going to be more than three independent systems from any random system that we choose. Because let's say, for example, that instead of race, that we choose ideology. There's never going to be any system that we can find in which there's only one opposite system. There's always at least two other ones. There's the thesis of any ideology which affirms itself, and then there's the antithesis, which is its exact opposite counterpart. And then there's the synthesis, which is the midway point in between its thesis and its antithesis. And all three of those systems are always there. There is no ability to reduce systems to less than that without committing some kind of a evil act. And I think in most cases, generally speaking, it's actually impossible to reduce the systems to less than three. If you attempt to do it, that attempt alone is unethical. But if you succeed in doing it, it will only be a success in practice, but not in theory, which means eventually it will get replaced. Even if you succeed in reducing the number of systems to less than three, and thus giving your own system at least half an equal chance, I guess I should say, of survival with the other independent system, if you do that, it will only last for so long, because eventually that system will die off. It will become intolerant of itself, because there will be something that changes in it that it can't tolerate, that goes against the rigid nature of the system. And the more specific that it gets, the less ability it has to control. So these systems almost always appear vague, and they almost always have almost no ideological structure. They're almost always reactionary, and they have some extreme emotional dependency. You have to be in a particularly emotional state in order to agree to whatever it is that they're saying, which is why they don't last. Because if you develop an ideological structure, you'll become for something instead of just against things. The moment that you start becoming for something and against other things, then that against starts to turn back in on itself on the things that it's for. So according to Saul Alinsky, for example, in his book, he says, Rules for Radicals, he says that no one ever stands up to their own standards. So they don't ever have perfect adherence to their own standards. So that means that they're going to be intolerant of themselves, at least slightly. They're going to hold themselves into some form of contempt because they're going to have made some mistakes somewhere. Now, if the group becomes so corrupted that it doesn't care what the person does, they only care who the person is or what their loyalty says on its face, then the group starts to break down, especially if it's just, well, you belong to the group on its face. What does that even mean if you have no ethical standards on behavior? Then somebody that's in the group can kill someone else that's in the group and it's still considered okay because they were in the group. And that becomes self-contradictory and the system can't stand. And Socrates brought this up in the Republic. And I really like that Socrates brought this up because with him being one of the pillars of our philosophical doctrine, he said first that if some group can't sustain itself, it's because it's evil, and that it will disintegrate because its members can't loyally belong to each other and hold each other in the same ethical standard, because if they did, they wouldn't be against the greater group that already does. So if you've got a group of law-abiding citizens that all are integrated and expect a strict accordance with their behavioral structure, their law, and then you've got another group that doesn't, then why wouldn't that group that doesn't adhere to those standards adhere to its own standards instead? Well, if you're a counter corruption group, if you're a whistleblower, if you're a coup giver or a revolutionary party or something like that, then yeah, maybe, but even then that only lasts until the government gets overthrown, and then you have to go right back to the same starting point. Is your system capable of adhering to its own standard of ethics? And obviously it's never going to be perfect at that, so then it has to tolerate that imperfection, and then that means it has to tolerate other groups, because other groups aren't going to follow those practices, and neither will we. No one will follow these practices perfectly. So if we then expect perfection in our behavior in accordance with these standards, whatever the standards are, we're eventually going to attack ourselves and hold ourselves into such contempt that we can no longer tolerate our own existence, because we will eventually break. It'll cascade. Somebody will kill somebody else off in the group randomly, and it'll be like that one-off thing, and then that automatically brings in their friends and their families. And they are going to have conflicting ways of looking at it. Well, Party A was in the right. Party B was in the right. The schism that formed will tear the entire thing open, because no one is going to kill somebody else and then have 100% approval. There's always going to be at least one dissident, and if there isn't one now, there will be later, and that's what ends up making the entire house of cards fall to pieces. Unless the system is tolerant enough that it allows those errors to happen. Another example that just popped into my head is black swan events. Like, some guy lost his luggage and then it ends up costing the entire airline company like $5 million in setbacks because he missed his flight, or he makes everybody else miss their time where they're supposed to land, or take off, excuse me, because he couldn't find his luggage for 5 minutes. So then he goes off and he finds his luggage in 5 minutes, and then the plane takes off 5 minutes late. So then it lands 5 minutes late, and because it landed 5 minutes late, nobody got to transfer over to their flights. So then all their flights are all fucked up, and it just cascades and cascades because there was no room for error. Everything had to be exact every time, and of course, chaos is going to enter, and there's going to be that one-off event that happens, and if the structure is too tight, too rigid to allow for that random fluctuation, that unanticipated result will tear the entire system to pieces, and it will leave a huge gaping chasm hole where there was, initially just a little tiny blip. And it's because everything was too interdependent. It was too tight. The clock was wound up way too tight, and then you tap it one time and the whole thing shatters to pieces because it's too damn brittle. And that's the hippie argument against the government. Well, get off my ass, man. You have to be like compassionate and stuff, and forgive my errors and things. That's what that argument is getting at, is if you get into a society that's too straitjacketed, it'll just end up driving itself insane. There's too many rules, and there's just not enough room for error for people to be able to live peaceably and breathe. But at the same time, you have to have some rules, because if you just allow everything, then that's not really a system, because, again, it's the same problem as before. There's not really any way of determining membership in a set that has no defining feature, in a group that has nothing that it's for. So like I said, most of the time when you run across a Nazi group or a communist group or something like that, they're going to be very against ideology and ideologues, because they don't believe in structure, because if they did, they wouldn't have invented what they did. If they believed in math enough, they wouldn't have turned in a homework with a bunch of wrong answers, or a refusal to do the work to begin with, because they didn't know what the answer actually was. So there's an anti or an exclusionary, reactive, emotive, pathological kind of a system, if you want to call it a system at all. It's really more of an anti-system that these revolutionary people end up occupying. And there is a fervor to it. It's almost a religious fervor, because the ideology becomes anything except this, anything except whatever the enemy is. And that's how they always start. And that, it's so easy. All we have to do is just get rid of them, and then everything's fine, because anything would be better than having to live with whatever that is. And that's why they end up with the religious fervor that they do, and that's why it grips so many people, is because it accepts every single ideology that there is, except this one in particular. And the sickness that happens in that is that there will be somebody that hates that system the most, and they'll always be more structured than the people that hate it the least. And this is an irony, just weirdly, that the only people that could possibly lead a revolution that's exclusive like that just hates another system, and the only reason that it exists is to kill the other system off, the leader of that system that wants to kill off the other one is always going to end up having an ideologue at the center that has some structure, because they're going to be the ones calling the shots and coordinating things and saying either withdraw or advance, or go over here or go over there, or kill this guy or don't kill that guy. And whoever's making those decisions is centralizing the power structure, which is then making it have a structure, which then, given its structure and its hatred combined, makes it hate itself, and it begins to implode. If that leader ever succeeds in overthrowing the government or killing off whatever population that it deems unfit to live, whenever it gets done doing that, the very next thing that it does is it starts nitpicking against its own members for, getting close to the line, but not crossing it, but just getting close to it, or fraternizing with the enemy, or, entertaining thoughts that go against the ideal of the group, and stuff like that will begin to appear. And it does so in a weirdly organic way. It does so without the intent of the original leader or the group. It just sort of happens. And it's because they keep agreeing about certain things, and they keep saying, well, I can identify this enemy system based upon these preliminaries, because I've just noticed that they all do this. And then it becomes a structure, because it's like, well, anybody that doesn't do that then must be good. So let's do the exact opposite of what that is. And then it starts to crystallize. And you give that enough time, and eventually it starts to become for all the things that the other system is against. It tries to be its mirror opposite and get as far away from that system that it can't tolerate as it possibly can. And that's what kind of eventually causes its own collapse. But in the beginning, it causes its birth. It causes it to actually rise up and become something that's a real structure. But the problem is, the structure appeared after the hatred, and the structure is only bolstered by the hatred. So if you got rid of whatever it is that you hated, you wouldn't have any reason to have the structure. So then they can't kill the enemy off, because the enemy is the whole thing that the entire system is built upon. The whole thing was built to get rid of the enemy. So without the enemy, it has no purpose, because once the enemy's gone, then it doesn't have any reason to exist. So then all that time that it took crystallizing all the stuff that was the exact opposite spectrum of where its enemy was on any given attribute, they're greedy, they're slutty, they're stupid, they're brown skinned, whatever it is that they've gotten rid of and gone the exact opposite way on, that is still bolstered by its opposition to its enemy. It doesn't have any value unto itself, and it could have just arbitrarily been whatever it was, but it was just the fact that that enemy system did this thing that made it so that the opposing system said, we're not going to do that thing. In fact, we're going to do the opposite of that thing. Because you did that, we're going to do this opposite thing. So once the enemy's gone, then they don't have any more direction. They don't have any more justification for anything, and they have to invent a new enemy. And the new enemy is just the little brother, the miniature version, the less extreme version of whatever it is that they just got rid of. So they get rid of the let's say the Nazis got rid of the Jews. Well, then they would get rid of the Jews' kids, right? The hybrids that are half Jew and half not Jew, and then kill all of them. And then they would kill all the kids of those kids, the ones that have 1/4 Jewish heritage in their blood, and then 1/8 and 1/16 and 1/32 and 1/64, and so on and so forth until they're all dead. And then when they finally got rid of killing all those people, then they would have to kill all the people that agree with freedom of the market or usury, making money off of making loans. Now they have no access to credit, and everybody is economically stratified, and you go back into feudalism because there's no economic mobility, because nobody can issue credit because Jews issued credit, so now we can't. And other things like that. And it just cascades, and eventually it rips itself apart because it's too rigid to function. It's intolerant of so many different things that would have helped it succeed, which is why the enemy chose to do it, that they just don't succeed in anything, and they just stop succeeding in everything. And that's what always happens to any group that starts off hating another group and gets built around hating another group. So it isn't that it's a cold universe. The universe does seem to innately dispatch of those people that have that negative view, where they just become intolerant of their environment or some deviation from some rigid belief set. Those systems don't last and can't last just by that fact, just by the fact that they're not all systems are the same. Given the natural diversity of systems, they can't be intolerant of each other because they're naturally divergent. There's natural diversity at hand. And that is something that lucidity recognizes and holds as sacred, is that God must have chosen to make the world like that. And that's why I like to use choice as my justification for standing up for things that allow or maximize choice, and standing against things that reduce choices to less than 3. Because of that reason, because there's always at least 3 types of systems and at least 3 types of choices: for, against, and I don't know, undecided, right? It's yes, no, or maybe on everything. And if you get rid of maybe and you say you're either with me or against me, well, then you don't really know if I'm really with you. All you know is that I'm too afraid to tell you that I'm against you because you'll kill me. Does that make me for you? Does that make me with you? Does that mean that you can trust me? Not really, right? So you can't really reduce things to either yes or no, or even to a more exotic one would be like if you reduced it to no or maybe, or yes or maybe. Well, well, then it's really just either the yes or the no. It's the maybe is just sort of like a stall for the inevitable yes or the inevitable no that you're pushing on the person. You say, oh, you can say maybe for now, just don't ever say no. Because then if you do, I won't tolerate it, Well, then you're not really tolerating the maybe either. It's just reducing it down to the yes. And that's what happens every time you reduce somebody's choices to a binary or an ultimatum. You're basically forcing their hand into one of those areas, because you're saying either it's this or it's something that's even worse than that. And so you automatically know which one is going to win out because it depends on the person's priorities. If it's a ransom case, either you pay me this money or your wife or your daughter die, something like that. Well, then I value my family's life, so here's your money, and so you force their hand. You know what they're going to do, right? So that's why I don't believe that God controls everything, and I don't believe that it's wrong to choose. And I also believe that you can choose to not be gay, and you can choose to be gay, and you can choose to move around on the spectrum. And those people who think that, well, I would never be gay, you could. If you were pushed hard enough, you could. You could eventually change your spectrum, and vice versa. Oh, I'll always be gay and I'll never be straight. You can't make me straight. Yes, actually, it is possible to turn someone straight. It is. And that then, in some weird way, it kind of bolsters the Old Testament, and yet it tears it to pieces, because it's like, well, you can't be gay because you're allowed to choose, and it's a product of choice. These associations that you draw are random. They're arbitrary. Most of them were just given to you by the society that you were born into. And the rest of them that you think that you came up with on your own were mostly, again, due to opposition to that system. So it isn't the case that you just originally independently derived whatever it is your opinion is. You borrowed it from other people and you mishmashed the ideas that you liked together, and you took away what you wanted from the buffet and left everything else. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the only thing that we really can do. But the fact that we all do that means that there's not much to be said for these traditional belief systems where people only believe them because they happen to grow up in a geographic location. What it means is that we can't be so intolerant of other religions that we think that they're incorrect simply because they don't follow a particular book or a particular messianic figure or religious icon or scriptural dogma. What we have to do instead is judge them by their tolerance and intolerance of other religions. And that's really the only meta evaluative structure that we could use, because that's what we're measuring. If we measure anything other than that, then we're going to end up with different answers for every religion, which doesn't really help us between them. It doesn't help us determine which ones are better than others. But if we wanted to measure which religions are best and which religions are worst, it's the religions that are worse are the ones that don't tolerate anything, and the religions that are best are the ones that tolerate everything, as far as like other religions being concerned, where they don't kill anyone off for believing something other than what they believe, even if the person is going to kill them. Vis-a-vis Christianity is better than Islam. Jesus died for our sins, Muhammad killed for them. Which one ended up dominating most of the world? If Islam was so great, why is it so tiny? Why are there so few people that will, bother to follow it? Because it doesn't have much to offer. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't. The idea of being so absolutely intolerant of any wrongdoing that you perceive as being wrong, by the strictest of all possible codes that none of the own followers even follow, and is so arbitrary that it could be based off of someone's testimony, let alone what they actually do, but just what other people say they do, is enough to get you stoned to death. If that's the case, you're not going to have a society that's able to trust anyone, not even each other, inside of that system. Because if someone were to say that I didn't read the Quran today, or I only prayed 4.5 times to Mecca instead of 5 times, or I was 5 degrees off when I tried to face toward Mecca, or whatever it is that pissed somebody off that day and decided they were going to strap a bomb to their 5-year-old kid's chest and send them over to me, is not going to be, very holy to any other religion except it. And again, even inside of itself, there would still be some people, I would hope the parents of the kid, that would disagree with that choice and would say, no, that's probably not the holiest choice. There's probably a better choice that could happen than just strapping a bomb to your 5-year-old child's chest and send them over to me. So that's what I think, anyway. Now, again, because of the ironic openness, they can argue that no, that's wrong, that tolerance actually has nothing to do with holiness. In fact, it's intolerance that is holy. And they can argue that all day long. They can do that as long as they want. And they can kill people and do all kinds of things. And it doesn't make it a case that you're not allowed to be a Muslim. Or if you're a Muslim, then you're going to get searched more often or more deeply than other people, or you're going to get hauled off to jail just for being a Muslim. And all of that stuff is out the window. You have to allow the religion, and you have to allow people to believe in it and profess it and all that stuff. But the moment that they start killing them, killing other people, I don't care how holy you think you are, I'll go against your God and put you in jail if you kill someone. And I'll go to hell if that's what it takes. But I just, personally, me, I can't really bear a world or accept a world. I am intolerant of a world in which murder and rape and theft are tolerated. I can't tolerate those, because if I tolerate those, then I can't trust anyone. And if I can't trust anyone, then life isn't really worth living for me. So if somebody else thinks that, well, there's exceptions, you can steal and lie and kill and rape and all that stuff as long as they're them that you're doing it to. The Jews or the infidels or the rich or the poor or whitey or blackface or whatever it is that you just happen to hate that day and decide isn't a person anymore. I don't buy it, and I think that all people are people, and I don't think that you can say that it's okay to kill someone just because they said something that you don't like. I don't think it's okay to kill someone even if they killed someone. So, that's why I think my system will outlast theirs, is because my system doesn't, even though my system doesn't tolerate things that their system does tolerate, like murder and rape and theft and all that, as long as it's to the quote-unquote deserving ones, the infidels or whoever it is that they hate. The reason that I believe that my system will outlive theirs is because, again, their system, being that it allows those things, is necessarily going to make it very difficult for people to trust each other, and it makes it very difficult for people to have purpose in their life, because there's such a looming shadow that's around them at every corner. They could be accused of having committed a crime for which they could get put to death before anyone even figures out if they actually did it or not. It makes it very difficult for people to trust and have loyalty and cooperate with each other in a system that's so rigid that anything could get you indicted, where everything is considered wrong no matter what you do, because there's just too many damn rules. You can't eat certain foods, so now you got to check everything all the fucking time. You can't skip any of these prayers, so now you have to interrupt your workday all the fucking time. You can't run outside without your veil on or whatever. And so then that interrupts your ability to express who you are all the time. People can't even see your facial expressions anymore. So you're limited in your ability to communicate. And it just depersonalizes people to the point where they just no longer have any more purpose. And of course there's going to be backlash. Of course there's going to be people that defend it. And there are only going to be people that defend it in places where they can choose not to do it. And there will be no dissent from people who are forced to do it, because they don't want to do it when they're forced to do it, because they can't want to do something that they're forced to do. And that's what my point is it's like, yeah, you can advocate for these ideas to the moon as long as the person can just put them down and pick them up whenever they feel like it without any retribution. The moment that you have coercive retribution for not doing a compelled act or for doing something that's outlawed, if you convict a person for that, then they won't want to do it, because they can't want to do it because there's no alternative other than to do it. It's like forcing someone to pay taxes and then calling it charity. It's like, no, man, that's not charity. The person had to pay. They didn't choose. They were forced. It doesn't allow them to be charitable because they are forced to pay this no matter what. Not because they chose to, but because they had to. So the problem with the way that systems are operating on this planet right now is that there isn't talk like this about the objective or universal or equal judgment of all religions or all ideologies based off of a single metric. And I admit, you base any measurement off a single metric, it's not going to be as accurate as it could be with many measurements. So why stop there? But we definitely should have more than zero. Right now, this planet has no ability to form a truly universal, acceptable way of comparing religions. It just says whatever it says, given whoever the person is. And like I said, yes, there should be diversity, and that should always be the case. But there should also be the choice not to be like that, where you do have a common way of measuring all the religions. And the people that believe that that measure is the right measure should be able to freely assemble together and defend themselves against those who don't. But they shouldn't be allowed to antagonize their neighbors and create bloody borders and, all that stuff. Or even their own members. And that's why we don't like cults. Or it's like, I'm going to love bomb you and tell you that you're, perfect for this group and you're just so great. And then I'll make you confess all your sins in front of everybody. And then I'll blackmail you because you admitted that you drowned your own puppy in the bathtub when you were 10 years old because you thought that it was having fun, but in reality it was dying or something like that. So because you did that and you told everybody that you did it, well, now we're going to hold you in contempt for the rest of your life. If you ever fuck up, we're going to bring up that dog, man. That's the first thing. You're a puppy murderer. And you're going to go to hell unless you do something to absolve yourself. So the measure is in choice because of chaotic systems. And chaotic systems are in place because if the total system arrangement of our objective universe were static, we wouldn't exist. We cannot exist in a static time because without change, there is no time. And then we wouldn't really be here at all. The fact that there is a flowing of time means that there is change. The fact that there is always change means that there's always diversity. There's always another way. And if we're intolerant of that, then we're intolerant of the very universe that we live in, and then we become intolerant of our environment, and then we die. It's not a threat, it's just the way it is. It's the cliff, and you don't want to be the baby on that cliff.